Look. Pretty, isn't it? Perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
Yeah, we're back to Elden Ring. It's been a few months since my last critique of the game, and that's no coincidence. While I always intended to make a part 2 to that video, I wanted to wait until a lot of the Elden Ring post-nut clarity finally kicked in. The game is mine and countless others' game of the year. It sold 12 million copies in just over 2 weeks and dropped to immediate widespread critical acclaim. And the success isn't unwarranted. I can't think of a recent video game more deserving. And the Souls series is among my favorites, so more people getting into it sure as hell isn't something that I'ma complain about. But Elden Ring praise kind of reached a level of fanaticism at which anything short of you praying to Miyazaki 5 times a day was blasphemy. If you were saying anything that could even be misconstrued as negative about the game, then you had to be burned at the stake. This led to people opening up their reviews of Elden Ring by defending their opinions with disclaimers like, "Hey guys, I actually really like the game, it's one of my favorites, and I played all the other ones, so please respect my opinion." Wait, didn't I basically just do that? Son of a bitch. In my last video, which I highly recommend watching before this one, I focused primarily on the multi-boss fights in Elden Ring and how it compares to previous games in the Souls series. In this video, I want to take a step back and look at the game's bosses as a whole, and touch on some things I didn't get to in the last one, and also address some of the more common criticisms. Starting with get good. Get good. Get good. Get good. Did you consider getting good? So basically they made double boss fights a bit harder and added a mechanic you need to out-heal. How about you get good instead of just double boss fights? Although these games all share the same core gameplay, the series has actually changed greatly since the 2009 release of Demon Souls, and this is most evident when looking at the bosses. Demon Souls featured a lot of what most people know as gimmick bosses, enemies that largely revolve around a single mechanic unique to them that you have to exploit in order to defeat them. Dark Souls retained a lot of those same ideas, but also expanded on bosses that place a greater emphasis on attack windows and dodge timings. Dark Souls 2 Bloodborne marked the biggest departure from the Souls formula, where the game's enemies attacked with greatly increased speed. Dark Souls 3 drew heavily from Bloodborne, and as such, its bosses also had the faster tempo introduced in the last game. Sekiro was a complete overhaul on FromSoft's combat system that retained next to nothing from the past games. However, every time that FromSoft made a significant change to the enemies, the player character was also altered to be better equipped at taking on the new challenges. DS1 introduced self-replenishing healing in the form of the Estus Flask. Dark Souls 2 Bloodborne had the quick step. Sure, enemies move faster, but so do you, and trading with them is not only more viable, but is actively incentivized by the rally mechanic. Dark Souls 3 has a dodge much more similar to Bloodborne's than Dark Souls. Even the heaviest roll in DS3 is faster and has more invincibility frames than DS1's medium roll. The difference is night and day when you jump from playing any of the games from Bloodborne onward back to one of the older titles. New bosses would never have worked with the tools the player had in the previous games. Putting the Orphan of Kos against a 2009 Demon Souls enjoyer is like handing a small Victorian child a jewel. They're both dying in 2 hits. So how did From Software alter the player character in their latest game? Before moving on to Elden Ring, I want to take a moment to tell you about this video's sponsor, Atlas VPN. Atlas VPN is a digital tool that filters all of your internet traffic through an encrypted tunnel and hides your virtual location. Through Atlas VPN's simple and intuitive interface, you can choose a server from a ton of different countries that quickly connects you to a new IP and DNS address. Just one click and you're done. I'm somebody who greatly values their privacy. I mean, it's the reason why you're looking at this graphic right now and not my face. And when browsing the internet, you never know who or what might be trying to steal your information, so it's important to stay protected. Right now, Atlas VPN is running a huge discount where you can get a 3-year subscription for $1.99 a month. but it won't last forever, so click the link in the description below to sign up. The VPN not for you? No problem. Atlas VPN offers a 30-day money-back guarantee, but you'd be missing out on great features, like the tracker blocker that prevents websites from tracking your browsing habits. Connecting to a virtual private network also enables you to stream shows only available outside of your country. If I want to watch my favorite anime, I just change my location to Japan and hop on Netflix. If you're not a weeb like me, you've got a bunch of other countries' streaming libraries to choose from. But don't just take my word for it. Click that link in the description and get Atlas VPN for just $1.99 a month. And now, back to Elder Bling. Just like the past games, Elden Ring had their enemies play a bit differently to keep combat fresh. And to make sure that players could keep up, the player character needed some new abilities. And thus, we were given the jump button. That's it. And guard counters. You may be wondering, hey, what about all the spells? What about the Ashes of War? But right now, I just want to focus on the player character's basic capabilities. Just like how you think about rallying in quick steps before arcane and hunter tools when thinking about Bloodborne's combat, those base mechanics are more important as they're constants that will be present in nearly every playstyle. As a general rule of thumb, if a game mechanic has a dedicated button on the gamepad, then it's a core mechanic. I don't think anyone will debate that walking, running, jumping, and rolling are all fundamental abilities. Attacking with the L1 and R1 are fundamental as well. But what weapon you attach to those buttons is up to your playstyle. Your build is what supplements your basic abilities and makes your character unique. This comes in the form of weapons, talismans, ashes of war, physic flasks, or even spirit ashes. Elden Ring boasts an absolutely insane level of build variety, encouraging you to tackle bosses with whichever tools you most enjoy using, even if it is a disgusting Moonveil. So how do you go about making sure that every single build is equally balanced? Well, you don't. You can't. With so many options, there's no feasible way to make sure that each and every tool is on a level playing field with all of the others. Builds are typically a give and take. While a certain build may excel in one area, it's lacking in another. Someone using ranged spells is going to have an easier time with flying enemies, but their damage is going to take a major hit when fighting bosses with high magic resist. This weighing of pros and cons and tailoring your character to your preferred playstyle is what makes build variety such a compelling feature. But Elden Ring has a few tools that are just better. Items that give the player immense value with absolutely none of the trade-offs. At the cost of just 1 or 2 healing flasks, you can summon your very own Pokemon to take aggro, deal damage, or in some cases, solo entire boss fights. Unsurprisingly, this makes things a hell of a lot easier, and that's a good thing, right? I like the idea of summons. They highlight how FromSoft bakes their difficulty options into the gameplay rather than having it on a menu slider. If the game's too hard for you, there are in-game resources you can make use of to lessen the difficulty. People who aren't masochists can choose to summon, and those who like a challenge can opt out of it, and that's that. It doesn't hurt anybody. At least in theory. In reality, people who don't summon are gatekeeping Dark Souls fanboys who get off on soloing bosses, and people who do summon are pussies who didn't really beat the boss. Of all of Elden Ring's new features, Spirit Ashes were definitely the most polarizing, and it's clear to see why. Unlike an overpowered weapon or spell, Spirit Ashes are low investment, making them easy to slot into your arsenal regardless of build. This led to the just summon crowd, treating it like any core game mechanic, rather than an optional add-on for those that the feature appealed to. You know, kind of like a build. Summoning fundamentally changes the gameplay. Bosses aren't equipped to handle fighting more than one person, and they just turn into walking punching bags with a summon in the room. Oftentimes you can kill them without seeing half of their moveset, or skip an entire phase. Spirit Ashes effectively lower a boss's health by half, and throw a few spare flasks in your pocket. That's not a playstyle that's going to appeal to everybody. Just summon is not an all-powerful phrase that absolves every aspect of the game from criticism. If you want to summon, summon. Hey bro, have you beat Malenia yet? Nah man, I'm still struggling on that actually. What? Bro, just summon. Yeah man, I tried that, but personally I just don't find it enjoyable. Like the boss just becomes a piñata and I don't really find that fun. So you think you're better than me, huh? Is that it? What? No, man. It's just not for me. Like, I mean, it's cool if you do it, but you Dark Souls have like different experiences. It's not. Don't come to school tomorrow. It's funny to me that the group of people who rallied against elitists who think their playstyle is superior became elitists who think their playstyle is superior. I see more people getting clowned for not summoning than summoning. On the other side of things, I don't understand people against summons who say that Spirit Ashes ruined the game, and so they're worried about From Software's future. I couldn't disagree more. Spirit Ashes aren't responsible for the change because the game is not balanced around summons. Bosses having these extravagant moves with insane tracking that scream fuck you and fuck you in particular is proof enough of that. They're not going to design these moves and then balance them around you, trivializing all of them and not seeing 90%. Bosses don't fight 1v2, they fight 1v1 and alternate between targets. Regardless of how accessible Spirit Ashes are, they're still designed to be optional supplementary items. If From wanted to make spirits a core element of gameplay, there's no shortage of ways to communicate this to the player. Rather than the spirit calling bell being an easily missable item given by an NPC, it would have been given the same importance as something like your healing flasks. Or each class could have started the game with their own low tier summon instead of only a single one being offered as a starting gift. Spirit Ashes are no more core to the gameplay than the literal ball of shit that you can throw at enemies. Take a game like Persona 5, which is a game where, if the title didn't give it away, you fight using personas. Being a turn-based RPG, your options in battle are literally spelled out for you on the screen, and hey, would you look at that? You start the game with a single persona, and it's up to you to grow your collection. Different personas have access to different elemental attacks, and your character's stats are determined by whichever persona you have equipped at the moment. Even if your character is at max level, it makes no difference if you're still using a level 1 persona. Your level just determines the strength of the personas you're allowed to hold. With so many fundamental game mechanics being tied to personas, it's clear that the combat was balanced around this system. But personas aren't the only way to access things like stat buffs and elemental attacks. Items like bombs and magatama allow you to deal damage of any element regardless of your persona. Striking an enemy with its elemental weakness knocks them down and grants you an additional turn. Normally, your other party members each specialize in a single element, but items bypass this limitation and allow any character to strike any weakness. You can trivialize a lot of encounters by stringing together knockdowns like this and finishing off with a powerful attack. And none of this relies on the most central component of the combat system: personas. Despite how powerful they can be, items are still treated as something that's supplementary to the core gameplay. There's a reason why a playthrough without personas is called a challenge run, and a playthrough without items is just a playthrough. Saying that a player who just doesn't want to summon is the same as someone who chooses to do a level 1 no-hit run of the game is misguided at best and blatantly disingenuous at worst. It confuses me when people say that the entire game is designed around summons, when there exists a boss who is actually designed around summons, General Radagon, and everything from his presentation to his arena is made distinct from what's seen throughout the game. He's painted as this larger-than-life legend, and his fight is contextualized by a festival in which champions gather and attempt to defeat him. You see these champions when you enter the castle, and then the light from their summon signs beckon you once you're in Radagon's arena. And what an arena this is. Nearly a third of Caelid is dedicated to hosting this one battle. Radagon is a giant, and instead of having heavily tracking attacks that scream "fuck you" specifically, he says "nah, fuck all of y'all." He aims wide with each and every swing and has nasty AoE attacks, clearly designed to take on multiple people. And if that doesn't kill them, his phase transition will. When your summons die, you frantically run around the map reviving them, while this behemoth skating on his anorexic horse is on your ass. FromSoft leaned heavily into a raid boss kind of encounter, and I think it really worked. It's the best NPC summoning has felt in any of these titles. The fight still has some rough edges, like the 1-minute song and dance you have to do every time you die before the fight actually begins. But on that first run though, it really sells you on the grand scale of the fight and adds to the spectacle of it all. And spectacle is something that Elden Ring has in spades. So does this mean that the other bosses are balanced around solo play? Well, your mileage may vary. Like I mentioned before, bosses change and grow from game to game to keep things interesting, and the Elden boys definitely learned some new tricks, but the player character is also compensated with new skills to keep the challenge fair. In Elden Ring, that compensation doesn't go much further than the jump button and the guard counter. Aside from that, you're still playing as Jonathan Souls III from DS3. Things like input buffering and attack commitment remain unchanged in this game. These are relics of the past from when combat was still this slow back and forth which required you to be incredibly deliberate with each button press. But in a game where bosses jump into the air and do acrobatics for 7 seconds, land on the ground and jump back in the air to defy gravity with an inexplicably delayed landing, Fortnite default dance all over your body, cancel their dance into a no-hand triple backflip Dempsey roll Super Saiyan Giga Drill Sage Mode Gear Second pelvic thrust, it's inexcusable. A lot of the cool shit that lets you better deal with these bosses is gated behind particular builds and items. I'm not a fan of this because it incentivizes certain playstyles a lot more than others. Again, Bloodborne's quickstep and rally weren't enabled because you equipped a certain sword or staff. It's something that any character can do. Sekiro allowed you to cancel your attack into a block early into the animation because that's what the gameplay called for. As things are in Elden Ring, the boss and the player are playing two different games. Now, I don't think that the player should be on a level playing field with the bosses. These are supposed to be demigods, and that title wouldn't mean much if they were all pushovers who had to sip Estus every 2 seconds. The fact that you're at a disadvantage is what makes these games fun, but you should still be playing the same game as those bosses, meaning that they follow the established rules and that those rules remain consistent. Unfortunately, Elden Ring bosses are playing Minecraft creative mode, and you're still stacking blocks in Tetris. Some folks defend this by saying that the game is not supposed to be fair. People on my multi-boss fight video said that the bosses not playing fair is better because it's more realistic. You know, realistically speaking, attacks don't have to synergize with each other. Real enemies wouldn't bother synergizing or giving you room to breathe. They're trying to kill you. Why would they be fair? This is a completely asinine argument. It's not realistic that a boss has the weapon best suited for killing him located just a few feet into his room. It's not realistic that you can parry a cat the size of a fucking elephant. It's not realistic that bosses wait till you beat them half to death before deciding to buff up. It's not realistic that Melina travels with the player yet fades into thin air when not at a sight of grace. It's not realistic that you can bait demigods into jumping to their death. It's not realistic that a man stands there monologuing when he clearly sees you charging up an attack to end his life. It's not realistic for a flying enemy to do anything except attack you from the air. By this logic, Calamite is the only realistic dragon fight since he has to be forced out of the sky. Every other dragon fight sucks because it's just not realistic. At the end of the day, this is a video game designed to be enjoyed by players. And just how enjoyable does a realistic fight against a 90-foot tall giant sound? Yes, lore and narrative should be consistent with how the player interacts with the world, but it should never come at the cost of gameplay. Margit sets the tone for the game's bosses, and he does a pretty damn good job. I loved this fight my first time around, and I still think it's one of the best the game has to offer. A few of the common complaints about Margit are his delayed and branching attacks. Dark Souls 3 was the first game in the series to prominently feature delayed attacks. It was an interesting way to freshen up the combat and keep the player vigilant. It also fit well with some of the bosses. A boss like the Dancer, who moves in this eerie, unnatural manner, is complemented well by weird irregular attack intervals. Margit's delayed attacks feature him pulling back on his cane, bracing, and then charging forward. I have no problem with this attack. It's visually readable and has a short, consistent delay, so it's not that difficult to see coming. But I can't say the same for when he holds his cane above his head and just eternally tracks you until you stop moving and eat that shit to the face. This happens pretty infrequently though, so it's only a minor gripe. The much more divisive part of this boss are his branching attacks. Margit has combos that can either end at a certain point or continue with a follow-up from his holy blade. This follow-up depends on your positioning and your inputs. Yeah, I know it's technically animation reading and not input reading. You're not the only one who's seen the Zully video, but it's effectively the same thing in practice, and more people notice input reading, so I'ma say input. Enemy attacks based on position have been in these games forever. I mean, it wouldn't make much sense for a boss to start slashing in front of him when you're not there. Enemies do different things based on where you're standing. The difference in Elden Ring seems to be that these proximity-based attacks are follow-ups, and the window in which they come out isn't very clear, which both contribute to the conditions under which they happen seeming arbitrary. I think this was done to make bosses' windows of vulnerability feel much more dynamic, where before you could see a particular attack start up and know that at the end of it you're guaranteed free damage, you now have to wait until the attack ends to see whether or not you can get some hits in. I like this idea, and although it was a source of a lot of frustration the first time around, it became manageable on subsequent playthroughs. However, this system is entirely undermined by input reading. If you wait until an attack finishes, see a window, go to attack, and the boss follows up only because you chose to do something, that's not going to feel great to play against. The windows go from just feeling arbitrary to actually being arbitrary. Anywho, once Margit's balls finally drop, he becomes Morgott. This is hands down the best boss reuse in the game. Similar to Genichiro and Sekiro, Morgott is somebody who repeatedly tries to impede the character's progress at multiple stages in the game. Not to mention he's a shard bearer. There's a legitimate reason why we fight him again, and he even has the courtesy to learn some cool new tricks before our second date. Unfortunately, I hate these new tricks. Morgott is an insanely cool boss, with insanely cool moves, but I don't play video games to watch an AI constantly rub in my face how big his dick is. Pause. The most egregious part to Morgott's never-ending combos is that at the end of him, he will frequently jump away to the other side of the arena, completely eliminating the window you had to punish, after which he'll start slowly walking back towards you. I can't imagine any practical reason for this. Enemies jumping away after their turn doesn't add any challenge or anything interesting to the fight, just frustration. A common trend with many bosses in this game is not that they're too hard, but the kind of challenge that they present just isn't fun. There is such thing as good and bad difficulty. If the game turned your screen off whenever you entered a boss room and forced you to beat it blind, no one's gonna argue that that makes it harder. But is that shit fun though? Rykard is a boss that relies much more on spectacle than any kind of difficulty. This fight presents a unique solution to two problems several Souls bosses have had. It manages to create an engaging gimmick boss and an oversized enemy that doesn't have camera problems. DS3's Yorm fight with the Storm Ruler is extremely similar to Rykard, but unlike the Serpent Hunter, the Storm Ruler only has one attack that gets increased range and damage. Elden Ring went a step further and augmented every single attack in the weapon's moveset. This simple change brought some much needed variety to the encounter and elevates it far higher than Yorm in my book. And unsurprisingly, being able to fight from farther back keeps the game's camera from being an issue. Another boss with a unique solution to the camera problem that plagues a lot of the larger enemies is Fortisax. Throughout the fight, Fortisax teleports around the arena, but never directly on top of you. By repeatedly teleporting, he always resets his position to neutral, and makes it so his attack comes out at an angle visible to the player. My only real complaint about this fight is the absolutely criminal runback that I can only imagine is in service of the spectacle. A dragon fight that I don't have many nice things to say about though is Fortisax. Much like Midir from Dark Souls 3, Fortisax takes reduced damage to any part of his body that's not the head, clearly incentivizing players to target that weak spot. Only thing is, it's unreasonably difficult to hit his head. He practically never lowers it, and even with jumping attacks, it's very inconsistent. And if you decide to play the long game and target his body, you get tagged by his red lightning, which will periodically hit you with homing attacks that strike independent of what Fortisax is doing, meaning that you may roll to dodge the lightning, only to come out of your iframes and immediately catch a claw to the face. So what exactly does the game want you to do? With Midir, both the head and the body were perfectly viable strategies, but Elden Ring, a game with much more build diversity than before, seems intent on limiting those options. I'm not gonna lie, on my first playthrough I honestly just said fuck it and spammed rock sling. But hey, at least the fight is a cinematic spectacle. So, Malekith, what about Malekith? Well, he's a really cool spectacle, but listen, I don't give a damn about your fucking spectacles, okay? I have had enough of the spectacles. Give me a good mechanical boss fight. But he do the backflips. Just look how cool he is. Godfrey is probably one of my favorite fights in the game. He has the perfect mix of high, low, fast, and slow. Many attacks can be jumped, rolled, or even just strafed. He also has optional position-based follow-ups that don't feel cheap. But to even things out, he also has one of the most delayed attacks in the game that I give a pass for one reason: its visual clarity. The exaggerated motion before he slams the ground makes it clear when to roll, and the fact that he's stationary means you always have time to run back and dodge from a distance. He gets this pass immediately revoked the moment he enters phase 2. Horalu has some of the most ridiculous delayed attacks in the game. Delays where a boss is charging, winding up a hefty blow, or when the boss is characterized as sporadic and off-kilter work. Horalu, though, delays in the cheapest way imaginable. You know, with this game more than any of the others, it feels like FromSoft does certain things not to create an interesting challenge, but purely to fuck with the players, which I imagine is where a lot of the complaints about artificial difficulty come from. In this move where Horalu leaps at the player, he inexplicably slows down time itself and spends longer than expected in the air just to delay his grab. There's no rhyme or reason to it. He just says, fuck it, slow motion.
Yo, look who fell asleep first. Prank him, John. You already know.
Is he frozen? Why isn't he moving? Did he?
Yo!
A perfect example of a boss with well-executed delayed attacks is Moog, which is a great fight all around. His Blood Flame Talon has two parts. He first slashes the air and the claw mark explodes after a brief delay. Another variation of this attack is when he pulls his arm back and then lunges forward with a fistful of Blood Flame. With either variant, the second part is what deals damage. If you dodge the moment you see him move his arm, you're guaranteed to be caught by the second half. You have no choice but to wait and see the motion play out before committing to an input. Each attack's first part is also visually very distinct from the second, making it so there's no confusion about what's happening. That readability really goes a long way in making the move feel fair. On the topic of fair and balanced bosses, it's time to talk about everyone's favorite. There isn't much that hasn't already been said about Malenia. Waterfowl bad, fuck this shit, mimic tier go brr. I'm sure to touch on some of the things that you've already heard, but I'll be sure to keep it brief. Malenia embodies what I mentioned earlier, that there undoubtedly exists good and bad difficulty. Even within the confines of a game series known for its difficulty, harder does not mean better. The form in which the difficulty manifests is what makes or breaks it. I've beaten every single mandatory and remembrance boss in this game at rune level 1 and hitless, and I will still tell you that Malenia is a horribly unbalanced, unfair mess. To start with, she completely ignores and outright breaks several mechanics. Her lifesteal is something unique to her, and would be fine if it didn't heal the same amount on blocked hits. And as much as I'd like to see shield users get humbled, I'm never a fan of playstyles being invalidated in this manner. Malenia can have her stance broken like any boss, but during certain moves she gains hyper armor and resists stance break, which even that would be okay, but if you hit her during this, it still consumes the full stance bar and resets it to 0 as if she had been stance broken. Regular staggers are also inconsistent because she's able to cancel her stagger animation, literally cheating the mechanic itself. My one biggest problem with this fight that I honestly don't hear many people talk about is her idling. I touched on this in my last video, but dual bosses don't ever go passive. Instead, they become reactive and just slowly walk around until you input a command and then they can punish that. This also applies to solo bosses, and Malenia is without a doubt the biggest offender. In her first phase, she'll sometimes do absolutely nothing besides slowly walk towards you for a full 30 seconds, just waiting for you to do something. Anything so she can bury her sword in your throat the moment that you do. You're waiting for her to do something, she's waiting for you to do something. It's like when you get a text at 2 AM to come over and watch Netflix and both of y'all gotta sit there and pretend you don't know what you're both here for. What do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do? I don't know. What do you want to do?
Give me some time!
This creates so much unnecessary downtime and adds little more than frustration. And Waterfowl, you've heard enough about Waterfowl. Although I will say, in this entire game, there is not a single thing more satisfying than when you managed your first flawless dodge of Waterfowl Dance. Whether that alone justifies its inclusion, I'll let you decide. Fortunately, Elden Ring ends with a bang in Radagon, a fight so painfully close to perfection. His unrelenting aggression, his mix-ups, his seamless transition into delayed charge attacks. Radagon is Elden Ring's combat at its absolute peak, and falls short in just a few areas. In his second phase, Radagon starts teleporting in between attacks, like Lorien in Dark Souls 3, but one major distinction is that the teleport itself deals damage. He can also come out of a teleport already attacking. This creates situations where Radagon will dodge your attack with a teleport, appear right on top of you before you regain control of your character, stagger you with the teleport, come out of it swinging, and combo you into a permanent nap time. Radagon is also tied with Horalu for the worst delayed attack in the game, and it's also a grab. He raises his hand in the air and just kinda walks towards you until his arm gets tired, then he brings it down on your head and forges a new Elden Ring with your intestines. This is another case of the game doing shit just for the sole purpose of fucking with the player. The way Radagon just slowly walks forward while holding his hand up in the air for an arbitrary amount of time before bringing it down all at once looks absurd. Like, is he charging up his grip strength? Luckily, that's where my complaints about this fight end, and also the game. Yup. After Radagon, the game immediately ends with nothing after it, as Radagon is the final boss of the game. My thesis remains unchanged from my last video. Elden Ring was an incredibly ambitious game, with a heavy focus on skill and spectacle, and a ton of other new ideas. New ideas that weren't all gonna hit the mark. This game featured the greatest disparity between its highest highs and its lowest lows. While the multi-boss fights were something that were far more consistent, that is to say consistently shit, exploring the quality of Elden Ring's bosses as a whole is a bit more nuanced, and that should be reflected in this video's longer runtime. Join me in another 3-month gap when I complete this trilogy and talk about the open world. And as a wise man once said, fuck Elden Beast.